On August 25, 2026, the surface of Lake Mead sat at 1,039.116 feet above sea level. That is the lowest reading since water first began pooling behind Hoover Dam in the 1930s, and it broke a record that had already been broken 3 weeks earlier. Now here is the part that does not fit the story the country has been told for 25 years. A large share of the water that should have been sitting in that reservoir this summer did not evaporate. It did not fail to fall as snow. It did not get pumped onto a cotton field in Arizona. It is sitting in a different lake 300 miles upstream because a federal agency decided in April to leave it there. 40 million people across 7 states, 30 tribal nations, and 2 Mexican states draw from this system. The number they watch is the elevation at Hoover Dam, and that number is now being set less by the sky than by a spreadsheet. I'm Simon, and the reason Lake Mead keeps setting records has almost nothing to do with the rain that fell this year. The drought is real. The mega drought is real. But drought is the pressure on the system. It is not the mechanism. The mechanism is a set of decisions, some made in 1922, some made in April of 2026, that guarantee this reservoir loses water even in years when the river behaves. To understand that, you have to stop looking at the weather and start looking at the accounting. Because the water in this reservoir has been disappearing along 3 separate paths for a very long time, and only one of them runs through the sky. The other 2 run through a document signed in 1922 and a set of steel tubes bolted into a dam upstream in 1963. Those 2 are the ones that decide what happens next. Start with what the reservoir actually is. Lake Mead is not a lake in any natural sense. It is the water that backed up behind a 726-foot concrete wall wedged into the volcanic rock of Black Canyon, and it is the largest reservoir by capacity in the United States. Full pool at Hoover Dam is 1,229 feet above sea level. At that height, the reservoir holds roughly 26 million acre-feet. 1 acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons. Today, the lake holds under 7 million acre-feet. It is roughly a quarter full, and it is sitting about 190 feet below full pool. You can see the difference from the highway. The white band running along the canyon walls, the mineral crust left behind as the water dropped, is now taller than a 15-story building. It is not a stain on the rock. It is a record of where the surface used to be, written in calcium carbonate, and it is the single largest visual marker of a water accounting failure anywhere on the planet. Below that line, the numbers matter more than the picture. At 1,035 feet, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines can no longer run safely. At 950 feet, the dam stops producing electricity entirely. At 895 feet, water no longer passes through the intake towers by gravity at all. That is dead pool. Right now, Lake Mead sits about 144 feet above that final number, and roughly 4 feet above the first one. So where did the water go? Begin with the piece almost nobody outside the basin has heard of. It is called the structural deficit, and it is the reason this reservoir would be shrinking even if the drought ended tomorrow. Water does not simply flow from Lake Mead down to Yuma and across the border. It travels roughly 300 miles through open desert in a warm, shallow channel, through canals, past riparian vegetation, under summer air temperatures that regularly exceed 110 degrees. On that journey, it evaporates off the surface, it seeps into the ground, and it is drunk by cottonwood and salt cedar along the banks. The Bureau of Reclamation's own assessment of losses along the lower Colorado mainstem puts the total at roughly 1.3 million acre-feet every year. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has put the figure closer to 1.5 million once canal inefficiency is included. Here is the detail that turns a physics problem into an accounting problem. For most of the last century, none of that loss was charged to anybody. The upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, have long absorbed evaporation from their own reservoirs against their own share, something on the order of 468,000 acre-feet a year. The lower basin states did not. Arizona, California, and Nevada were credited for the water delivered to their headgates, and the water that vanished in transit was simply subtracted from the reservoir. Nobody's legal entitlement shrank. The lake absorbed it. Chuck Cullum, executive director of the Upper Colorado River Commission, framed the scale of it plainly when this fight came to a head. The agency was not assessing the physical tax of evaporation against anyone's water rights, and over 20 years those uncharged losses add up to something close to the entire contents of Lake Powell. Read that again. Not a bad snow year, not a hot summer. An accounting convention run for 2 decades that quietly drained the equivalent of the second largest reservoir in the country. That is what the term structural deficit means. Lower basin consumption plus system losses exceed what enters Lake Mead each year by roughly 1.2 million acre-feet in a normal year, with normal snowpack, with nothing unusual happening at all. J.B. Hamby, chairman of the Colorado River Board of California, has described it in exactly those terms, and in February of this year proposed eliminating that 1.2 million acre-foot overdraft outright and locking in 1.5 million acre-feet per year in durable reductions so the reservoir could begin rebuilding storage instead of bleeding it. The proposal exists. It has not been agreed to. Now layer the older mistake underneath it. In November of 1922, delegates from 7 states met in New Mexico and signed the Colorado River Compact under the direction of Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. They divided 7.5 million acre-feet to the upper basin, 7.5 million to the lower basin, and a 1944 treaty later added 1.5 million to Mexico. 16.5 million acre-feet of paper promises. The flow records available in 1922 came from an unusually wet run of years. Tree ring reconstructions later showed the long-term average was closer to 13.5 million. The most recent Congressional Research Service accounting is starker still. Consumptive use across the basin fell from 13.8 million acre-feet in 2021 to 13.3 million in 2024 through genuine conservation, while actual flows over that same window averaged about 11.9 million. The basin conserved hard and still spent more than the river carried. There is one more claim on that shrinking supply that rarely makes the headlines. Mexico's 1.5 million acre-feet is not a courtesy. It is a treaty obligation between 2 sovereign nations signed in 1944, and it cannot be renegotiated inside an American conference room. 30 federally recognized tribal nations also hold rights on this river, many of them senior to the states that surround them, and not one of them had a seat at the table in 1922 when the water was divided. Every proposal now on the table has to be squared with both of those facts, and the arithmetic does not get easier when you add them in. So before a single snowflake fails to fall, the system is already engineered to lose. Overpromised on paper by roughly 3 million acre-feet, and undercharged in practice by another 1.25 million. That is the baseline. Drought sits on top of it. If you are getting value from this, subscribe. We cover water systems, infrastructure, and the engineering decisions behind them as they develop, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is happening. Which brings us to 2026, and the decision that explains why this particular summer produced record after record. The winter that fed this year was the worst on record for Colorado River Basin snowpack. By April, Reclamation's forecast for Lake Powell's water year minimum probable inflow had fallen to 2.78 million acre-feet, roughly 29% of the historical average and among the lowest figures ever recorded. The April 24-month study projected that Lake Powell could drop below 30,490 feet, its minimum power pool, by August of 2026 without intervention. That projection triggered something the public barely noticed. On April 17th, the Bureau of Reclamation announced it would cut the annual release from Glen Canyon Dam to Lake Mead from 7.48 million acre-feet down to 6.0 million acre-feet. That is a reduction of 1.48 million acre-feet, roughly 20%, and the lowest annual release in decades. At the same time, beginning April 23rd, it started moving between 660,000 acre-feet and 1 million acre-feet down from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming, more than 400 miles upstream, to prop Powell up through spring of 2027. Understand what that means at Hoover Dam. Nearly 1.5 million acre-feet that would have arrived at Lake Mead this year did not arrive. It was held back on purpose. Lake Mead's record low this August is not purely a measurement of the sky. It is partly a measurement of a transfer, and the reporting around the August 7th record was explicit that the record would likely keep falling in the months ahead precisely because the government is holding water upstream to protect Glen Canyon Dam. So the obvious question, why would the agency responsible for delivering water to 40 million people deliberately starve the reservoir most of them drink from? The answer is a plumbing problem, and it is the least discussed engineering story in the American West. Glen Canyon Dam produces power through 8 penstocks, feeding turbines rated at roughly 1,320 megawatts. Below elevation 3,490 feet, those penstocks are above the waterline, and the turbines stop. Water can still be released, but only through four steel tubes called the river outlet works, positioned roughly 100 feet below the penstocks. Those tubes were built for occasional use. They were designed to bypass water during floods and special releases, not to carry the entire flow of the Colorado River month after month. In 2023, during an extended low elevation release, those four tubes suffered severe cavitation erosion. Cavitation is what happens when water moves fast enough that the local pressure drops below its vapor pressure and bubbles form inside the flow, then collapse against steel with enough force to strip metal away. Reclamation began an $8 million relining project in April of 2024 to repair the damage. The agency has stated plainly that those outlets were not designed for sustained low-elevation operation. There are also the dam's original hollow jet valves, still on the list for refurbishment or replacement, with an appraisal study of 3 modification options not due until the end of this year or early 2027, and any actual construction requiring congressional authorization and money that has not been appropriated. That is the constraint at the center of everything. Reclamation now operates to a target of 3,525 feet at Lake Powell, a 35-foot cushion above minimum power pool, deliberately built in so the agency has room to act before the turbines and the outlet works are at risk. Holding that line in 2026 required both levers at once: less water out of Powell, more water in from Flaming Gorge. And the water for that cushion comes from downstream storage. It comes out of Lake Mead. The Gila River Indian Community, which receives Colorado River water through the Central Arizona Project, has told Reclamation in writing that the United States has a duty to fix Glen Canyon Dam because tribal water rights are directly at risk if the dam cannot physically release enough water. Governor Stephen Roe Lewis put that in a letter in March of this year. Arizona, California, and Nevada argued through the environmental review that the agency should evaluate physically modifying the dam rather than treating a 1960s outlet design as a permanent law of nature that the entire basin must plan around. Reclamation kept the modification question in a separate review. The trade-offs of that choice are not abstract, and they showed up again this month. Each year, Reclamation considers releasing cool water from deep in Lake Powell through those same bypass tubes, mixing cold reservoir water with warmer surface water to protect native fish in the Colorado below the Grand Canyon. Sending water through the tubes means sending it around the turbines. In early August, federal officials decided against the cool water release, citing significant hydropower generation concerns under already strained system conditions. A threatened native fish was left more exposed so that a dam could keep making electricity. That is what triage looks like when the margin is gone. Every remaining option costs something that used to be free. Downstream, the consequences are now measured in megawatts. Lake Mead's operating margin at Hoover Dam has effectively vanished. 12 of the dam's 17 turbines were built for a reservoir that stayed between 1,100 and 1,200 feet, and below 1,035 feet they faced the same cavitation damage that chewed through the tubes at Glen Canyon. Reclamation's own projection shows available generating capacity falling from about 1,288 megawatts in July of 2026 to 337 megawatts by April of 2027. Tom Bushatsky, director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, put it without hedging in mid-May. The reservoir is going to 1,035, and there is no question about it. The engineering response is real but small relative to the problem. 5 wide-head turbines, redesigned to spin efficiently under lower pressure, can operate down toward 950 feet. In May, Reclamation announced $52 million from the Hoover Dam Post-Retirement Benefit Fund to replace up to 3 more of the older units with wide-head machines. Once those are installed, the capacity cut below 1,035 feet drops from roughly 70% to 58%. That is a meaningful improvement. It is also a plan to lose less, not a plan to recover. Las Vegas, for its part, solved its own version of this years ago, and at enormous cost. The Southern Nevada Water Authority's third intake sits at roughly 860 feet, below Deadpool, reached by a 3-mile tunnel bored under the lake bed, paired with a low lake-level pumping station that came online in 2020. The combined bill ran past $1.4 billion. It is worth being precise about what that money bought. It did not add a drop of water to the Colorado River. It bought one metropolitan area the ability to keep drawing from a reservoir that other users can no longer reach. everyone else on the river has a legal claim. Nevada also has a straw that goes deeper, and that is the second layer of this, the one that turns an engineering story into a political one. The rules governing all of it, the 2007 interim guidelines and the 2019 drought contingency plans, expire at the end of 2026. The 7 states were given repeated chances to write their own replacement and did not manage it. A framework deadline passed on November 11, 2025. A final consensus deadline passed on February 14, 2026. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum convened the 7 governors, including a virtual meeting in July, and the meetings did not produce agreement. The core disagreement is narrow and it is genuine. The lower basin states have proposed mandatory reductions for themselves and have already exceeded a 3 million acre-foot conservation commitment, with roughly 3.7 million acre-feet projected by the end of this year. They want the upper basin to accept mandatory cuts too. The upper basin has refused, and its argument is not frivolous. Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico use substantially less than their paper entitlement. They have no large reservoirs to buffer a dry year the way Meade and Powell do, and their farmers already took reductions this year because the winter was extraordinarily dry. They see themselves as being asked to fix a deficit created downstream. Without consensus, the federal government wrote the rules. Reclamation published its final environmental impact statement on July 31, 2026, after a NIPA process that began in June of 2023 and drew more than 18,000 comments. The record of decision followed on August 21, 1 week ago, adopting a 10-year decision framework running through 2036 with operating guidelines issued in roughly 2-year intervals, and the first set, covering 2027 and 2028, was issued alongside it. Those guidelines take effect October 1st. 2 features of that decision matter more than the rest. First, the central organizing principle is infrastructure protection. Every alternative reclamation evaluated prioritizes keeping Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam operable across all runoff conditions, with formal consultation triggered if Lake Powell is projected to fall below 3,500 feet, and explicit authority for coordinated upstream releases to protect critical infrastructure. The policy that held water back this spring is now the framework going forward. Second, for 2027 and 2028, the federal government adopted the reductions the lower basin states had proposed for themselves and imposed no mandatory reductions on the upper basin. The arithmetic of that lands hardest on one place. The Central Arizona project delivers Colorado River water to Phoenix and Tucson through 336 miles of canal, and it holds among the most junior rights on the river, which means it is first in line to be cut. Officials have warned that Arizona faces reductions to its river water of up to 77% under the federal framework. Colorado has signaled it will litigate if it has to. Arizona has retained outside counsel and expanded its legal budget. 2 separate courtroom fights are plausible at once, including a Supreme Court dispute over how the 1922 compact should be read, which is where the drought story and the accounting story finally meet. The mega drought is genuine and it is severe. The 2000 to present period is the driest, sustained stretch the Southwest has seen in roughly 12 centuries, and each additional degree of warming strips a few more percent off the river's flow. But drought is not why Lake Mead has fallen roughly 160 feet since the summer of 2000, when the surface stood just under 1,200 feet. Drought is why the cushion ran out. The fall itself was built into the system, a compact that divided more water than the river carries, a loss column nobody was charged for, and a dam upstream whose 60-year-old outlet works now dictate how much water the largest reservoir in the country is allowed to receive. That is the answer to the question in the title. It is not the drought. It is the drought landing on a ledger that was already broken, operated by an agency whose first obligation is now keeping 2 concrete structures functional. So watch these numbers. Lake Mead needs to fall roughly 4 more feet to reach 1,035, and Reclamation's July forecast places it at 1,031.61 feet by April of 2027 and 1,009.69 feet by June of 2028. Lake Powell is projected at 3,491.92 feet in March of 2027, less than 2 feet above the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam stops generating power at all. The new guidelines take effect October 1st. The lawsuits, if they come, will take years, and during every one of those years, the river will keep responding to the same 3 inputs it always has: snowpack, temperature, and evaporation. Meanwhile, Up in Black Canyon, nothing dramatic is happening. The turbines are still turning. The taps in Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles still run. The surface of Lake Mead dropped about half a foot last week and roughly 2 feet over the last month, and the white ring on the canyon wall climbed a little higher, one measured increment at a time, toward the line where 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines have to stop.